I was 8 years old the night it happened. My parents rarely went out in the evening, but it was New Year's Eve, and they'd been invited to a party at a neighbor's house down the street. They assured me and my older brother Tim, who was 12, that they'd be back before midnight and that we'd be perfectly safe. "It's only a few houses away," my mom said, hugging me tightly. "We'll check on you, and you have the house locked up. Just call us if you need anything." They left at 9 p.m., and for the first hour, everything was fine. Tim and I made popcorn, watched TV, and joked about how we had the house to ourselves. But as the hours passed, the quiet began to settle in. Our house was in the middle of the woods, surrounded by tall, skeletal trees that swayed in the winter wind. With our parents gone, it suddenly felt far too big and far too empty. At around 10:30, Tim got bored and went upstairs to play video games in his room, leaving me alone in the living room. I turned off the TV and sat by the big bay window, staring out at the snow-covered yard. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the driveway, and the forest beyond the house seemed darker than usual. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the yard, half hidden by the trees. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but as I squinted I realized it was definitely a person. They were tall, wearing a long coat, and standing perfectly still, facing the house. My stomach tightened, and I felt a rush of fear. I wanted to scream for Tim, but my voice caught in my throat. I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was probably just a neighbor or someone passing by. But when I glanced back, the figure was closer. They had stepped out of the trees and were now standing at the edge of the driveway, still staring at the house. I scrambled off the couch and ran to lock the front door. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. I grabbed the phone from the kitchen and called my mom, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried my dad's phone, but he didn't answer either. "Tim!" I shouted, running upstairs. He was sitting on his bed, headphones on, completely oblivious. I yanked them off and told him what I'd seen. At first, he didn't believe me. "You're just imagining things," he said, rolling his eyes. "It's probably nothing." But then we both heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the living room. We froze. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Slowly, we crept down the stairs together, my hand clutching Tim's arm. The tapping was coming from the window. The figure was now standing right outside the bay window, their face hidden by the shadows of their hood. They raised a gloved hand and tapped again, slowly and deliberately, as if they knew we were watching. Tim grabbed the phone and tried calling our parents again, but no one picked up. "Lock all the doors," he whispered. "Now." We ran through the house, double-checking every lock. When we got back to the living room, the figure was gone. The yard was empty, and the driveway was undisturbed. For a moment, I thought maybe they had left. Then we heard the back door rattle. Someone was trying to open it. Tim grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and motioned for me to stay back. We crept toward the kitchen, where the back door led out to the patio. The door handle jiggled again, harder this time. I could see it turning, little by little. Tim stepped forward, gripping the bat tightly. "Go away," he shouted, his voice shaking. The handle stopped moving. For a long moment, there was silence. Then came a slow, heavy knock on the door, followed by a man's voice. "Let me in," he said, his tone calm and almost polite. "I just want to talk." Tim shouted again, telling him to leave, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he started knocking harder, the sound echoing through the house. My heart was racing, and tears streamed down my face as I clung to Tim's arm. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. We waited, holding our breath, but there was only silence. After what felt like an eternity, Tim peeked out the window. There was no one there. We didn't sleep that night. We sat together on the couch, the bat by Tim's side, and waited for our parents to come home. When they finally walked through the door at 12:15, we ran to them, sobbing. My dad checked the yard and the locks, but there was no sign of anyone. He told us it was probably just a prank, but I could see the worry in his eyes. The next morning, we found something that made my blood run cold. On the bay window, right where the figure had been standing, was a single handprint. It was smeared and wet, like whoever had left it had been dragging their hand down the glass. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, But every New Year's Eve, I can't help but think about that night and how easily it could have ended differently. It was the summer of 2005, and I was 10 years old. My parents had started going out for date nights every other Saturday. They always hired this one babysitter, Karen, who was 19, friendly, and seemed like the perfect fit for watching over me and my little brother Tommy, who was only 6 at the time. We trusted her completely. But looking back, that was the mistake. Karen was good at her job. She made us grilled cheese sandwiches, let us watch scary movies, and even played board games with us. She had this easygoing vibe that made her feel more like a big sister than a babysitter. But there was one thing she always did that made me feel uneasy. She always kept checking her phone. Every 5 minutes, her eyes would dart toward it like she was expecting something or someone. One particular Saturday night, my parents left around 6 p.m. Karen showed up, her usual bubbly self, and everything seemed fine. She brought over a DVD she said was a childhood favorite of hers, but the case was blank, and when she put it on, it wasn't a movie at all. It was some weird, grainy home video of kids playing in a park. The kids were laughing, running around, and climbing on jungle gyms. I assumed it was just an old home video of her and her friends, so I didn't think much of it. But something about the way she stared at the screen, completely silent, gave me chills. She didn't even react when Tommy asked if we could watch something else. After dinner, Karen sent us to bed earlier than usual, saying we looked tired. Tommy and I shared a room, so we whispered about how weird she was acting. I wanted to ask her what was up, but I didn't want to seem rude. Eventually, Tommy fell asleep, but I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. Around 10 p.m., I heard Karen talking on the phone downstairs. Her voice was low, but she sounded serious, nervous even. I couldn't make out the words, but then I heard the front door creak open. At first, I thought my parents had come home early, but there were no voices or footsteps after that. Just silence. I stayed in bed, frozen, until I heard Karen's footsteps heading up the stairs. She opened our door just a crack and peeked in. I shut my eyes, pretending to be asleep. I felt her standing there for what felt like forever. Finally, she whispered, "Good. They're still asleep," and closed the door. I couldn't breathe. Who was she talking to? What did she mean? Still asleep? I decided I had to do something. I waited until I heard her go back downstairs before slipping out of bed. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peeked down. Karen was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone again, but this time she wasn't alone. There was a man sitting on the couch with her. He looked older, maybe late 30s, dirty, with unkempt hair, and a jacket that looked too big for him. Karen handed him something. It was hard to see in the dim light, but it looked like cash. Then she pointed toward the stairs. My blood ran cold. I hurried back to my room and shook Tommy awake. "We have to hide," I whispered. He was groggy and confused, but didn't argue. We climbed into the closet, squeezing ourselves behind a pile of old winter coats. I could barely hear over the sound of my own heart pounding. Moments later, the door to our room creaked open. I could see Karen's shoes through the slats of the closet door. She walked slowly, almost like she was checking to make sure we were still asleep. Then, to my horror, I saw the man's boots enter the room behind her. "Which one is the older one?" the man asked in a hushed voice. Karen pointed to my bed. "The top bunk." I almost screamed. Karen knew I wasn't in the bed. I wasn't even in the bunk bed at all. She was lying to him. Why? I clamped my hand over Tommy's mouth, silently begging him to stay quiet. The man stepped closer to the bunk bed and leaned over, peering at the empty mattress. "He's not here," he growled. Karen sounded panicked. "What do you mean? He should be there." She ran out of the room, shouting my name, like she was trying to lure me out. The man followed her, cursing under his breath. I knew we didn't have much time. I grabbed Tommy's hand and opened the closet door as quietly as possible. We climbed out the window onto the porch roof, then shimmied down the drain pipe. My feet hit the ground, and I didn't look back. We ran as fast as we could to the neighbor's house and pounded on their door until they answered. The police arrived a short time later. They searched the house but found no trace of the man or Karen. The officers said Karen must have run when she realized we'd escaped, and they promised to track her down. My parents came home to a driveway full of flashing lights and a swarm of officers asking questions. I never saw Karen again. Months later, we found out that Karen had been working with that man to rob houses while babysitting. She'd learned the layouts when the parents were out and how to cover her tracks. But the police couldn't explain why they targeted my room that night or why she pointed to my bed when she knew I wasn't there. I don't think she ever planned to just rob us.